Hello, and welcome to A Reader's History of Science Fiction, Season 2, Episode 14. I'm Alex Howe, and with me today is Dr. Margaret Weitekamp. Dr. Weitekamp is the curator and chair of space history at the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum, and she is the author of the new book Craze, America's Enduring Fascination with Real and Imagined Spaceflight. Dr. Weitekamp received a bachelor's degree from the University of Pittsburgh and a PhD in history from Cornell. While a graduate student, she spent a year in residence at the NASA headquarters history office. She later taught women's studies at the Hobart and William Smith Colleges in New York before returning to Washington to work at the Smithsonian. She is also the author of the award-winning children's book Pluto's Secret, An Icy World's Tale of Discovery. Hello, Dr. Weitekamp. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
So, briefly, what is Space Craze and how did it come about?
Space Craze is really the book that I wish somebody else had written when I became the social and cultural curator at the National Air and Space Museum. So I got the chance to come to the Smithsonian in 2004 to take this newly created position to be the historian and the curator for the social and cultural history of spaceflight. And that's a collection that includes memorabilia of space science fiction, as well as the memorabilia and souvenirs around the actual space program. And I saw a lot of connections between those things. And as I was writing about them and talking about them with my colleagues, I would be saying, well, these things are examples of the way that spaceflight was popular in the 1930s. Or these things are examples of how the space flight was very popular in the 1980s or the 50s or the 60s. And my colleagues pushed me and said, that means very different things, doesn't it? And I was like, yes, well, of course it means very different things. And that's really then where I was starting to look for who has written about this. How can I come to grapple with what does it mean that spaceflight has been this enduringly popular theme in American culture and American popular life? And then what does that mean? How do I pull apart the different threads of that, but at the same time see all of these continuities? And in the end, that book became Space Craze.
And that naturally means your focus is a little bit different from mine because I'm covering the entire history of science fiction. I spent 2 years on this podcast working through it step by step, and that analysis was very literature-centric.
Yes.
Starting with Frankenstein, Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, and then I talked about film, television, and other media as it came up. But you started with Buck Rogers in the pulp magazines and comic strips, and you do give some nods to earlier media, but that's where you start. And why is that?
Indeed, mine is a little bit of the reverse of the kind of study of science fiction that you have done, because I'm starting with artifacts and objects as one of my main sources of information. And so I'm very upfront about that in the book, that literary science fiction gets a little bit of short shrift other than the ways that it affects how space science fiction specifically has been thought about. So one, I'm looking particularly at enthusiasm about space flight, not science fiction writ large as the whole genre, but the way that it has focused on space. And also then I'm looking at what has produced objects, material culture, and how that helps to inform this analysis, which means I spend a little less time on the Jules Verne or the other kinds of literary science fiction that is a rich source of imagination about spaceflight through the 19th and into the 20th century. It goes back to the 1630s, actually. And that's really because, and it's the joke I make in the book, there aren't a lot of Isaac Asimov action figures. And so if you want to start with the things as one of the sources of analysis, and as a museum curator, I had the unique ability to work with the museum's national collection of cultural objects as the major focus of this book. For that, then I really ended up focusing much more on television and movies and popular culture in that way. And I think as a result, one of the major themes of Space Craze is also this question of how people have consumed popular culture. So looking at things like the pulp magazines, comic strips, radio programs, movie serials in the 1930s and 1940s, the birth of television in the 1950s as a popular medium, and then carrying that through to syndication and cable channels and the birth of DVRs and on-demand watching. And then now this kind of world that we live in where you really can get streaming in a variety of channels in ways that allow people to consume things differently, where there's a lot of good content on the internet and conversations amongst fans that have moved from genie bulletin boards in the 1990s to kind of full-fledged websites to conversations on Twitter and other kinds of social media. And so that really shapes the way that I was trying to analyze this question of spaceflight enthusiasm as a cultural phenomenon. So it's a slightly different project, although it overlaps nicely with the project that you've been doing to really unpack what is science fiction.
And I imagine since it's the Air and Space Museum, you're a little bit limited to the age of flight.
Yes, we tend to, in focus, look at that, although the literary collection that we have in terms of rare books goes back to some of those early things, Micromegas, being able to look at stuff from, as I said, from the 1630s, from looking at Cyrano de Bergerac, imagining a trip to the moon. That's less in this book project, but it is a subject of what we have at the National Air and Space Museum.
And for memorabilia, I suspect a lot of that, especially in the earlier days, was made for kids.
It has a bit of a kiddie focus, although I'm always looking at the ways that those programs then were consumed more broadly and had fans who were also adults. So one of the things that we find when we look at kiddie television programs from the 1950s, and space and science fiction was seen as a very safe topic for early television, when there was also a lot of larger controversy about the Red Scare and fears of communism. And so more political shows or things that would be seen as more potentially risky were then set aside, and they favored programs and genres that allowed them to do things that were safe, that were set in space. So this is clearly not about us now. It has that aspect of science fiction where they're defamiliarizing things. And so something like Space Patrol, which was a kind of police procedural set in space aimed at kids, that was on television. It started as a 30-minute show originally done for Los Angeles audiences and broadened out, really came to have both a national audience amongst children, but also they knew that they also had a lot of adult fans. So I think I'm looking at the ways that often things that are pitched at children end up having that broader audience and then that broader appeal.
Mm-hmm. And that's something that still holds true today.
I think very much so. I think that that passion for science fiction, that excitement about space flight, can often be something that's kindled as a child and then really it stays with people as they're adults.
And the flip side of that is what we now know as science fiction. I think there was not a lot of it written before Buck Rogers came along. The only thing I can really think of is Tom Swift.
Mm-hmm. And what I really look at and what I call the Buck Rogers archetype are the ways that American science fiction in particular took a particular form in the way that we imagined going into space. And that tended to be kind of heroic crew, very much modeled on what we had been seeing in literary and popular culture Westerns, with a muscular hero and a woman who was the love interest and the sidekick and had a lot of moxie, but a tendency to get captured, and a kind of youthful member of the crew, as well as an older advisory figure, a very avuncular kind of doctor or scientist who would advise. And that crew would then be getting on a named spaceship that has a bit of personality and character, heading to a space base placed at the point of a gun. And what I argue is that that Buck Rogers archetype gets set in the 1930s and really endures whether people are using it or whether people are deliberately playing against it. It's something that got very exported from the United States and then reflected back to us. But I think it has these uniquely American roots, and I focused on the Americanness not as some way of saying that this is universal, but in order to really focus on how culturally specific and rooted it is. And it is a connection to these stories that Americans tell ourselves about who we are as explorers, as adventurers, as pioneers, and the pioneer frontier rhetoric that often comes into spaceflight things. And even as that rhetoric was being challenged and changed in the 1990s, it continued to be a powerful part of the way that spaceflight imagination was defined, because it reflects what's going on in the broader culture. And I think that's important to look at, not only for how space science fiction has been popular in different ways in different times, but also how that same cultural foundation was the basis against which actual spaceflight was being planned. And so the human spaceflight program exists in that same social, political, cultural context. And what's possible for real exploration is defined in some ways by its grounding in and pushing against that same context.
I find it a little bit interesting that the Western was such a strong influence before the space race got started. And I can certainly see it with the spirit of exploration, but the link seems a bit weaker before the space race. And if you look at literature, you can see mysteries, you can see romances, you can see dystopian fiction. What was it about radio and television and comic strips that lent itself to the Western style?
The Western really becomes a genre in American writing and culture as the actual frontier, such that it was, is seen to have closed. So it's really at the very end of the 19th century, as you have the first census that says that there is no unpopulated or underpopulated land left in the United States. And then, in fact, you see the population shifting from being more rural to being more urban. And it is in that context, as there's some sense that the West and that myth of Western exploration and the frontier as an empty space that needed civilizing because it wasn't empty, that myth gets solidified as it is seen to be vanishing. And from that, then you have novels like the Virginian by Owen Lister, early 1900s, the decade. And that really starts to set some of the archetypes that we come to know in movies and literature, where there's this kind of myth and romance created around the Western. And I spend a bit of time in the book on the way that that gets historicized. A historian named Frederick Jackson Turner, who sets out this Turnerian thesis that says Americans are who we are as a culture because of this experience of the frontier. And so we need to understand that that's a fundamental part of American culture. And that then literary tradition really has solidified in the first decades of the 20th century in a way that then, when you get the space imagination layered onto it, and I'm not the first scholar to have pointed out the similarities there, but I wanted to really dig into how those similarities then get played out in toys, as the ray gun becomes one of the first toys to come out of space science fiction and has a long, powerful cultural life. And then I really wanted to look at how those interplays play out and change over time.
And do you see that Western tradition still having a lot of influence in science fiction today? Because I feel like when those tropes come up, it's more to deconstruct them nowadays.
I think that writers and creators tend to be also scholars of their own genre. They're fans themselves, and they've been watching and reading for a long time. So yes, I would agree. I think that you start to see with the show like Deep Space Nine in the 1990s, the Star Trek franchise. It was explicitly in its first season dealing with the idea that that outpost that was out in the far reaches of space as a bit of a space station, being a bit of a Western fort on the edges. They were explicitly talking about having conversations about the ways that that narrative of exploring something empty is offensive to the people, the Bajorans in that case, who already live there and who have been occupied and who are trying to reconstruct their society. But so I think you saw with those kinds of shows in the 1990s starting to deconstruct that. I think that, Joss Whedon's Firefly layered the Western on very self-consciously onto that space context. And I think that as you see now more recent versions of space science fiction, you do really see ways that people are explicitly in the writing, in the characterization, pushing back against these conventions that had been set in the 1930s and kind of then solidified in the 1950s. And I think that speaks somewhat to how powerful those images and that archetype had been, that it's still something that you have something like the creators of The Expanse explicitly setting out to say, this isn't going to be white guys in space. We're not doing that genre formation that had been set in the 30s and 50s. We're going to create this show in ways that deliberately push back against that. And I think looking at the overall cultural enthusiasm that Americans have had for spaceflight, it ebbs and flows, but it has some basic forms that are either being used or pushed against because the creators are aware of the power of being able to creatively deconstruct those things.
And talking about Star Trek, you spend a lot of time on Star Trek, which makes sense because it's one of the biggest franchises, and it ran concurrently with the original series with the real-life Apollo program.
Yes.
So, well, for one, would you say that the space race and Star Trek really played off each other at the time?
Very much so. And Star Trek, I think, is really path-breaking, in part because in the 1950s, when you had these kiddie space programs on television, they were relentlessly white. And that's not out of keeping with what television and movies and the entertainment industry was at the time, but because space science fiction gets seen as being kind of inherently a little bit futuristic, a view of perhaps a prediction of what is to come, that had really taken hold. And so Gene Roddenberry's vision with Star Trek in 1966 of men and women of different races and even a half alien all together on the bridge of the starship going to another place for these adventures, I think really was a very powerful vision in the time. They were very self-conscious in the creation of the original series of wanting, for instance, the Enterprise to look visually different than anything that might be on the drawing boards with the concurrent aerospace programs. They didn't want North American Aviation or Lockheed or somebody else to come out with something in 2 years that was going to look like their main vehicle that was supposed to be centuries from now. So you really have a radically new spaceship design that Matt Jeffries put together for the Star Trek Starship Enterprise. And then the way that that show is being done, they were explicitly talking in defamiliarized terms about urban unrest, about the civil rights movement, about other kinds of social issues that were really very relevant in the late 1960s. And also, I think there is a consciousness in the writers' room as well as for the fans that they're watching spaceflight, human spaceflight happening on a regular basis. And so Star Trek needed to kind of jump off from and do things that seemed sufficiently futuristic compared to what people were getting to watch on a regular basis.
And would you say that goes the other direction as well, with the space race being influenced by Star Trek, or did that more come later?
Some of that comes later, and you see that in the 1970s when the NASA wants to recruit a astronaut class for the space shuttle program with the idea of having mission specialists as well as pilot astronauts. Pilot astronauts tend to come out of a military training. Very often it's difficult to become a pilot astronaut without having come up through military flight training. Mission specialists were going to be a different kind of astronaut who had science degrees, who were medical doctors, who were going to be the researchers doing the work in the space shuttle program. And they saw the opportunity there to diversify the astronaut corps, more women, more people of color. And what they were finding as they were starting to look through the applications in preparation for making selections for what became the 1978 class is far fewer women and people of color than they hoped were applying. And NASA realized they had a legacy of past discrimination. That astronaut selection process had always been rather exclusive, rather focused on military trained pilots. And that pyramid in itself had baked into it, there were no women in that flight path towards being able to come into the astronaut corps. There were very few people of color who were a part of that. And so they actually hired Nichelle Nichols to do a public relations campaign and to go around and do radio spots and personal appearances and go to colleges and universities and speak to organizations of African American engineers, of women in the sciences, and encourage them to apply to the astronaut corps, really because space was going to be for everyone in this new era of the space shuttle. And that does result in a selection class of 35 astronaut candidates, amongst whom there were 6 women, 3 African American men, and 1 Asian American man. Now, not all of them were directly recruited by Nichelle Nichols, but I think it speaks to the way that when NASA needed to find a image that would help them explain their vision of a more diverse crew going into space, the answer was Star Trek. And that powerful vision from the 1960s that was by the 1970s in syndication and on your local channel every night at 7 p.m., where you could watch endless reruns of the original series. And that, I spend a lot of time on it, as you say, in that chapter, because I really want to set up the ways that that feeds into this explosion of interest in science fiction that comes with Star Wars and the revival of Star Trek, and also then the beginnings of the space shuttle program, which then kind of are running in parallel in the 1980s.
Now, Star Trek is an interesting case to me as someone who's studying the history of the genre as a whole, because you see a real dichotomy in different people's histories. I'm fond of pointing out on this podcast that the Wikipedia article for History of Science Fiction never once mentioned Star Trek or Star Wars. So it's much more literature centric. And yet these are names that are synonymous with science fiction today. And in fact, Star Trek is the show that gave us fandom in the modern sense, where it takes on a life of its own with dedicated conventions and cosplay and fan fiction and all that stuff.
That's really interesting. Do you think that's because of the ways that there's a perception, I think there certainly was in the 1970s, that these are not real fans, right? In the 1970s, in those existing science fiction conventions, which were much more literary focused and much more about come and meet the authors, come talk to the people who are writing science fiction, they started to get an influx of fans who were watching science fiction on television and who were excited about Star Trek, who were interested in wearing their costumes outside of just the masquerade parade that would have been a standard part of a science fiction convention where you dress up as a character from something that you've been reading. Star Trek fans innovated, as you said, cosplay, this idea that those people are so excited about their costumes, they want to wear them through the entire convention or wear them outside of those prescribed masquerade parades that were a part of science fiction. So I think it's interesting the way that perhaps there's still some of that initial tension that really showed up in the 1970s as Star Trek fans started to try to find their communities by going to science fiction conventions, which had been really the stalwart and the gathering place for fans of literature, of reading science fiction. So I think that that's an interesting evolution to point out, and the ways that perhaps Star Wars and Star Trek have been set off as their own thing and a bit aside from hard science fiction, from literary science fiction, however that would be defined.
I can see that happening. One thing I've noticed doing this podcast is that movies and television, not just today, but have always been downstream of literature. There have always been a lot of adaptations in the movie industry. And because of that, I could definitely see the literary science fiction people seeing themselves as the trendsetters, and movements in science fiction like the New Wave and cyberpunk, things like that, even today are still defined by literature first, I think.
I think that's exactly true. And I think downstream even farther are the objects, which is where I was starting my analysis. So you tend to, you're right, get things that are written first and then get adapted to, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. Sometimes the television or the movie versions of them take on a life of their own and start to kind of outpace the literary original sources. But then you get the material culture that comes out of it tends to come, since Star Wars, out of both films and sometimes out of television. It's interesting that that used to be flipped, that the material culture would be more often, toy makers were much more willing to attach a product to a television show because they saw that as having some longevity, and movies, they thought, kind of came and went. And so it's really not until Star Wars and the story of the toys that come out of that that you get that third downstream of the merchandise that and the memorabilia that comes surrounded to a movie, and that movies are then after that forever seen as being able to carry that. So I think there's also this interplay, though, that the novelizations of television or novelizations of movies, or that kind of literary stream where you get the Ballantine books that are writing are versions of, say, Star Trek characters, and then extensions of different stories that you may not have seen on television. So would you see those kind of novelizations of science fiction popular culture as counting in the literary category, or do they still stay over in the little column with the pop culture stuff?
I think for the most part, it stays in pop culture, and I would focus on tie-in novels more than novelizations. But either way, I think it leans more pop culture.
Interesting.
But one thing you mentioned about Star Wars and the transition from television to movies being the really big thing, I have to wonder if there's another factor that happened around the same time, which is the VCR.
Yes. One of the sub-themes of this, as I've said, is how people consume popular culture, because I think one of the things that happens when you deal with objects is you're thinking not only about the stories of their manufacture and their creation and how they're advertised and how they're sold, but then how they're received, how they're actually played with, how they're actually used, and the difference between toys that were expected to be originally right off the bat pulled out of their box and played with and out in the lawn to create scenes on Endor, so that you were out in the trees behind your house, for instance, with your Star Wars action figures, versus the new in box stuff that was supposed to be kept up on a shelf. And I think that when you look at objects, you're then thinking a lot about both production and consumption. And I think that that is really relevant to these questions of, what is happening in the 1970s and on in terms of how we receive popular culture. So that becomes an important theme for the book, is understanding the difference between watching a movie serial in a movie palace in the 1930s, where movies would have been on a kind of continual run. You didn't come to a movie time. You went to the movies whenever you wanted, and you came in and saw what was being played at the time. So there was a first feature, a second feature, a newsreel, a movie serial, perhaps some advertisements, and you could watch through twice, you could watch through half a time, and you would catch what you caught. And the movie serials were an attempt to get you to come back in. The VCR, I think, gives fans then an additional bit of control of what they're doing. And it also, in some ways that I find interesting as a museum curator, makes it material, right? You used to be able to go into someone's house or apartment and they might have racks of VHS cassette tapes, some that they've purchased where they've purchased a movie instead of just renting it from the Blockbuster, but some where they have recorded things off of television and you have your handwritten labels on the end that tell you what episodes you have on what cassette so that you can watch them later. And it was also one of the ways that people in the 1990s were dealing with a kind of beginning fracturing of the network landscape. So I went to grad school in upstate New York at Cornell, as you mentioned, and the local cable channel did not carry UPN, which was the United Paramount Network, and Star Trek Voyager was exclusively on UPN as a way to try to get fans to write to their cable carrier to get them to carry the channel. But I had a classmate whose sister lived in Florida and they got UPN. And so in the mail, she would get a VHS cassette tape that had the last two episodes of Voyager, and we're on kind of a list that she kept of folks who were fans, and she would pass that along. And I remember getting an email from her at some point because I had a paper due and I was in the midst of working on that, and saying, like, listen, I need you to finish watching the episodes because the next person is getting after me about they're waiting to see what's happening on this show. So I think that the internet turns into a way that fans begin to take some agency and some control of being able to talk back to shows. But you see that in the 1960s with the write-in campaigns that were paper letters that were, hand stamped and sent in to try to rescue a show like Star Trek. And you've seen that going through to The Expanse, where it was email campaigns and social media campaigns trying to save that show that ultimately ended up on Amazon Prime because they appealed to Jeff Bezos, who is himself a science fiction fan. So that's a long kind of rambly answer to your insightful question about VCR. I think the technology of how we consume popular culture affects what fans can do and how we respond to it and how we interact with it. And also it changes the business model. And very often the answer to why was such a thing such a way in a particular show or movie is an economic answer, because it is show business and they were working with what they thought would be most effective given the business model at the time.
Sort of tying several of these things together, Star Trek is another thing that has ebbed and flowed over the years. It kind of fizzled out in the 2000s and eventually came back somewhat with the Kelvinverse, but mainly on streaming. And of course, the streaming shows are very different in tone from the older shows.
I've been really interested to watch that because I start this whole journey as a fan as well as a scholar. So I grew up as a Star Wars kid and came to find Star Trek with Next Generation and have been a fan and have been watching. And I think what you see with some of the long form storytelling that is possible on the streaming networks now is playing with and against what the conventions of the genre have been and what the conventions have been that are set up within the franchise. So you get a show like Picard, which has these callbacks to what they were doing with Star Trek The Next Generation, or something like the new one that's reimagining the Enterprise with Anson Mount. I can think of all the actors' names and I can't think of Strange New Worlds.
Oh, Strange New Worlds, yeah.
So that's very much in conversation with the original series, and I think even with the Kelvin timeline and what was done with Star Trek by J.J. Abrams, and thinking about new ways of telling those stories. So the characterizations that have been set up, the world building that's been done, I think give a rich place for creative people to be telling new stories. And it's also a place where, as a scholar interested in this, there's a lot of great scholarship that has been done about the Star Trek universe, in part because the producers have been very tolerant of scholars and fans doing fan fiction, doing to the extent that they can without, getting too big. The kind of fan created shows where they're writing back and playing with those characters. But there's a lot of great scholarship in popular culture studies that started to be done in the 1990s, looking at Star Trek and gender, Star Trek and race, Star Trek and social problems, and the ways that you can really read those shows as texts that are in conversation with the larger culture at the time. And from that, then I was able to begin to kind of build some of this analysis that I'm doing. But it runs right up. Space Craze ends essentially in 2021, because that is when my book manuscript was due at the end of January of 2022. And so I was really writing right up to the very end of that. And there are ways that the creations that have been done in just the last few years wonderfully kind of complete the arc that I was trying to define, that I was seeing in what was organically in the material. And both the rise of commercial suborbital space tourism was a great end to the things I was writing about in terms of actual human spaceflight, and also then these latest shows that are very much in conversation with where this genre in popular culture started, and are playing with and playing against those things because they understand that the fans have that same cultural background and knowledge. And so they become both ways to jump into the Star Trek universe new in these new creations on streaming, and also then for the longtime fans to find wonderful kind of Easter eggs sprinkled in for them.
One thing I complained about with streaming when it first started coming out is that it's more atomized. At the time Star Trek Discovery came out, it may be different by now, but the lackluster numbers that Enterprise was getting in the 2000s were considered pretty good numbers on streaming. And the flip side of that is the blockbuster films are still huge. They're making $1 billion a pop. So I wonder what is leading the genre, and to some extent, if one thing or another still can lead the genre in the way it used to.
It's a good question. And I think the answer often, as I was trying to dig into why is this popular or how is this working in a particular moment or time, is often connected to that business model of what are they trying to do. So just to run it back a bit, in network television, for instance, when you had very few choices, the goal of network programming was to get you to not change the channel, to turn on primetime or turn on the syndicated program and stay with the same thing. Don't get up, walk across the room, and change the channel because you read your TV guide and found out that there was something on some other network that you wanted to watch. Just so it meant that you were looking for programming that was not objectionable. Nobody in the room was going to say, I hate this. Can we watch something else? Or and it was less about the fear that there would be something great somewhere else that someone could go to. Well, cable is the opposite of that. We need you to come and find the cable channel, to come and tune into that. And so you end up with things that have a niche in terms of, MTV, or the Weather Channel. It's going to be all the same kind of programming all the time. So you're going to know what that is. But for science fiction, that was often used as a way to try to draw people to a new programming channel, because science fiction fans have a reputation in Hollywood as diehard, as loyal, as, if you can catch them, they will come, they will bring their friends, they will write to folks and tell them to watch. They will try to support the continued creation of their stuff. And so in the cable era, you needed to be able to try to draw people. And you're right that one of the things that has happened is we now have more streaming, and kind of the predecessor is this atomization, and the predecessor to that is the DVR, right? The ability to shift the time of your viewing and to, I'm always at work until 7 o'clock. I can't count on what traffic is going to be. I don't know if I'll be home at 8. I'm going to set my DVR. And in fact, I'm going to come in, have a nice dinner, and then I'm going to watch my 8 p.m. show at 9:30 because that's when I'm ready to watch it. And so that's the beginnings of, you have people who are still having these water cooler conversations about shows that they've watched at the same time, but you might be running a bit behind what some of your friends or colleagues or coworkers are watching. And now on streaming, you can stay up all night and watch an entire season that just got dropped, or watch it or binge it over a weekend. And so it's much more separated in time versus how other people are watching it. I think it's been interesting to see these companies try to tie social media in. So try to kind of encourage people to watch things at the same time, because they know that they're going to have the stars of the show online on Twitter or on other social media, tweeting and having a conversation about it in real time. And you want to be caught up so that you can participate in that, or you want to not have to do a complete social media diet so that you don't ruin your favorite show for yourself by watching spoilers that were dropped the evening before. So it has changed our cultural experience, our social experience of what it means to be a fan. And we see that also globally, right? That not all of this content gets distributed evenly across the globe. So we used to think about this in terms of more local, what did your cable company carry was what you had access to. But now we've become much more aware of content that is streaming and online, but then things get carried in different ways. There was a great controversy around some of the Star Trek programming that, they switched from carrying it on Amazon, which carried it to many more countries, to carrying it on a different carrier, which went to many fewer countries. And they announced that 4 days before the actual launch of the show. And international fans were aghast. Like, what do you mean I'm not going to be able to see it the way that I expected to? So it has, I think, also the online social media world has made us aware of those disparities, because fans can tweet out or post on other social media channels their displeasure with this, or their excitement about it, either way. And we globally know about it pretty quickly. So the business models that underlie this, I think, have changed how we experience things. And I think it's then created a different dynamic around conventions or around fan groups, to be able to find the folks who like the same stuff that you like, because it may not be something that everyone's watching all at the same time.
Looking at all this change, both how the genre has evolved in content and how the way people interact with it has evolved, do you have a prediction for where science fiction is going in the future?
Ooh, that's a great question. That's hard. One of the evolutions that I've seen is better roles for women. And I think that you continue to see that, and you will probably, hopefully, see it happening without it having to be commented upon, without it having to be, oh, there's a strong woman in this. I point out a great scene in an episode of The Expanse where it's two of the women principals who are, escaping from an ambush. And so you have the Bobby Draper character as the pilot, who is bringing Avasarala but with her. And the conversation between them is just entirely about, it's now becoming a chase episode, the way that you would have had a chase movie in the 1970s. And so, that dynamic, it wasn't a special women's episode, or it was just, those were the characters that had been written. And so I think you're going to hopefully see that continuing and being something that we don't even have to comment on anymore. I think that you see the use of aliens over time in space science fiction going from being just the othering of, this is a way that we can talk about something that's different from us and hold it at an arm's length, to, in the 1990s, the beginnings of having alien characters who are sympathetic. So you have someone like Jakar in Babylon 5, who, has this whole dramatic arc where that character really becomes a fan favorite, and there's an expectation that you can, perhaps as an audience member, have the expectation that you can see through the eyes of someone that's different from you, which is very different from how the genre was originally set up, where the expectation was we all picture ourselves as the hero because everyone can take the perspective of the white guy, but we couldn't possibly imagine being the female character or being the alien, which was always set off as the often very racialized or sexualized other. So I think the prediction I would have for science fiction are the interesting ways that the world building can continue to include more real diversity and expectations that people will be able to, as fans, see themselves in those roles. And I think that one of the places that literary science fiction is really leading is the creative ways that they're thinking about world building. If you're dealing with a race of, or a universe of aliens, then they don't have to have the heteronormative or the other kinds of constructions of their society that we would carry forward. So very often in the past, space science fiction was kind of a version of who we are now, but in space. And I think there are writers now who are really doing creative things with extrapolation and defamiliarization of saying, if we're somebody completely different, how could we construct that world in a way that carries with it different assumptions from where we are now? I'm just finishing up The Spare Man by Mary Robinette Kowal. And it's a version of a murder mystery on a space-based cruise ship. And one of the things that she just baked into the world building, and I had a chance to talk to her about it, is the way that gender assumptions are not made. So when someone enters the scene, that character is described as they until they explain, and it's a standard part of this culture that you declare what your gendered pronouns are, and then the person uses them. And so it's one of the signs that one of the characters is a bit old, not just a bit old-fashioned, but in fact boorish, is that he's making gender assumptions and calling people he or she right off the bat. And that, of course, in this world is very rude. So I think there are creative ways that we've seen in literary science fiction that people are doing world building that bakes in new assumptions in ways that I think perhaps space science fiction popular culture will pick up some of those stories and bring those changes in world building with them.
And talking about diversity and representation, I have to wonder if there's a hidden contributor to that among the younger generations. And I think it's especially true for LGBT representation, which is customizable video game characters.
Yes. So the ability to create your avatar as you would like to be, and, with the full set of customization that doesn't necessarily put you into one form or another. That's interesting because I think, the counterpart in the physical toys would be in the 1960s, you did start to have some toys that showed, Barbie had an astronaut outfit, a Miss Astronaut outfit in 1965, or you had Major Matt Mason, also a Mattel toy that was a small, slightly bendable, posable astronaut figure that wasn't dressed or undressed. It came kind of, its body was the spacesuit, and there was an African-American character that was sold, but it was sold in the one pack, right? So you could get the Major Matt Mason or Sergeant Storm, you could get those characters as one packs. And there was a wonderful world of vehicles that came with them. Those were really what sold that set. But you could only get the Jeff Long African-American astronaut in the one pack. it didn't ever come in, that character wasn't pictured in the board game. That character wasn't a part of a multi-pack of characters that was sold. And so I think that spoke to the ways that there was an assumption that only really African American families perhaps would buy this toy, so that they had somebody their child could play with along with the other white characters that they surely would see themselves in. But there was not an expectation that the general audience, which was assumed to be white, would want to take on an African American character and see themselves playing through that character. So I think we've seen that evolve from this assumption made by manufacturers about what was possible in terms of embodying a character through play in toys, to now where we have this increasing customization of characters in video games where you really can be who you want to be. And there's an understanding that that creativity opens things up for fans in a way that brings many more fans in. And especially, the LGBTQ community has been active in being able to see that. And also disabilities, being able to play with characters, to imagine characters who have that not as a limitation, but who have that as just a part of who they are.
So to wrap up, I always ask for recommendations from interviewees, and your book, Space Craze, is all about America's relationship with science fiction in parallel with the real-world space program. So based on that, I think what I want to ask you is there a particular movie or TV show or any media really that you would recommend as a place to start to understand America's relationship with science fiction?
Ooh, that's hard, because the core course in American space science fiction is now, like a 6-semester slog to get through all of the kind of formative stuff that you would be watching. I'm going to do a little bit of a throwback and say, Deep Space Nine, I think, was a particularly rich place. It's one of the places where you see the shift from episodic television, which was the expectation in the network era, and into the cable era, that shows would reset entirely at the end of the half hour or the hour. And you see the shift then to some longer form storytelling that occurs across episodes, and where you're following a narrative where you really have to watch the episodes in order. But I think also they did interesting things with the depictions of aliens, with the use of women in powerful roles. Benjamin Sisko as a character, personified by Avery Brooks as an actor, I think was a really strong lead, and brought that African American context in, and was thinking in creative ways about what that meant to be a Black person in the future, and a real rich culture that he was drawing on. So I would say that would be my throwback place, where if you haven't watched it, that's a fun place to start. And it's an interesting mix of the Star Trek optimism and utopianism with what then becomes a very dark commentary on the costs of war and the memories of the costs of war.
Yeah, I was a 90s kid, so I definitely watched Deep Space Nine. And for one, it's a really good show. And for another, looking back from 2022, it really does feel ahead of its time in a lot of ways.
I think so. And I think that the commentary that they were having in the 90s was very embedded in the culture wars, the history wars, the science wars, about memories of earlier events in the earlier 20th century. But they were also just doing creative things about, commenting on what America as a war-fighting nation meant in the moment, and then also thinking about how that would play out in the future. So I think it's a fun place, and it's a few seasons. It's a older show, so it's not a 10 episode season. There's a lot to dig into and have fun with.
All right, well, Dr. Weitekamp, thank you again for coming on the show. It's been fun.
This has been great. Thank you very much.
This has been A Reader's History of Science Fiction. This podcast is hosted by Libsyn and is available on all the major platforms. You can find me on YouTube at Science Meets Fiction, on Twitter and Mastodon at Sci Meets Fiction, and my website is sciencemeetsfiction.com. For the next episode, since it's the Christmas season, I thought I would do a full episode on religious themes in science fiction. This will be retreading some old ground, but looking at it in a new way, and also covering some new ground as well, so be sure to check it out. And as always, thanks for listening.